Probably helps if I take my microphone off. Looks like we're assembling here. Just saw a note from HCTV that they're ready to rock, so thank you for that. I'm showing 6:57, and we're still, although I haven't looked at everybody who's here. Let's see if we have a quorum yet. Looks like we're waiting on at least one more member. Hi, Linda.
Mike, you have a quorum.
What's that?
You have a quorum.
Thank you. I'm still showing 6:57, so we'll give it a couple of minutes. All right, I'm showing 7 o'clock. We have a quorum, so why don't we go ahead and get kicked off? I'd ask for everyone who's not speaking. It looks like almost everyone's got themselves on mute. So if you could put yourself on mute unless speaking, that would be very, very helpful. I want to thank everyone for coming together on our virtual meeting for business finance. Certainly have increased the frequency of our discussions as conditions have warranted. Hearing a little bit of background noise, so if we can go ahead on mute if you're not talking at the moment. We, I believe, are streaming on HCTV, and we'll have recorded meetings or recorded versions of this meeting available at a later date. I want to set some context for tonight's meeting. We're certainly here to talk about budget and contingency planning And, we have two really potentially divergent worlds, the pre-COVID world and the post-COVID world. In the pre-COVID world, the school committee has established and passed the budget with assessments that went out to the towns that approximate $4.3 million greater than year on year over budget. We know the situation that we are all in. The towns, the state, and the uncertainty around tax revenues that are to be collected. And so with that, it's a reasonable expectation that come the end of this fiscal year, going into next fiscal year, that at least for some period of time we'll find ourselves in 1/12 budget. And so, again, thinking about our budget in two pieces. One is the assessment to the towns. The other is state and local revenues. We will need to certainly deal in the reality of looking at most likely looking at 1/12 budget going into next year. But when we think about state aid, we've had many discussions. We know that it's there's a lot of uncertainty that's around it. But to share some information we had from Senator Goby just earlier today. And this information is coming out of the Economic Summit meeting that was held a few weeks back that I believe she's summarizing for us, but gives us some framework for thinking about it. And just quoting a snippet from her, please note that anticipated $5 billion shortfall is expected for fiscal year 2021. When the last recession hit in 2009, the financial impact over 2 fiscal years was approximately $4 billion and resulted in a 28% reduction in local aid. So, the school district, our district, receives about $30 million in state aid annually. We're not sure how that translates into this year or as compared to other districts. But what's not doesn't take one far to imagine that the question of a reduction in state aid certainly looms large and can be very, very impactful for us. So, we've asked the administration to share its thinking about how we go into planning for next year. How are we thinking about these budget impacts, both from a 1/12 budget perspective, but also from potentially lower state resources coming in from the state, and share with this committee some of the thinking and pathways going forward. So, with that, I'll turn it over to Dan, and again, just as with meetings that we've had like this in the past, I'll ask Dan to make his presentation and complete it, and we'll look to take questions through the chat. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
All right, thanks, Mike, and good evening, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well and is safe given the situation that we're about, certainly unprecedented. I'd like to begin this evening first by speaking very quickly about this afternoon's DESE call and give a quick update on the CARES Act. And this is as of this afternoon at noontime. The DESE has filed its application with the federal government, and they are in the process of receipt of the funds. The DESE is hopeful that they'll have these applications available either this Friday or on Monday or Tuesday of next week. The allocation that is available to districts across the Commonwealth and for Massachusetts is going to be analogous to the FY20 Title I distribution. What does that mean for us? This year, Title I allocation is $268,000 and change. What the DESE is recommending that if you take 80% of that, which translates into approximately 214,000 and change, that is the value that would be associated with our grant application. These funds are extended over 27 months, and they can be used certainly for FY20. Certainly for FY21 and for the first 3 months of FY22. And again, this is hot off the press, if you will. So we will be going forward and looking at the application again once it is made available to the districts, either Friday or Monday or Tuesday of next week. In terms of the use of these dollars, they're fairly open-ended, and that's a quote from the DESE. How we plan to use them, that has yet to be determined. Now that we have some good direction in terms of the value of our grant application, and similar to the ARRA funds from almost 10 years ago, back in 2009, 2010, when those grant funds were available. These funds similarly will require quarterly reporting back to the DESE. So it's just a quick update on the CARES Act and the distribution of dollars across districts. We'll be looking to submit an application fairly soon, most likely regarding FY21. And again, administration, just hearing this today, we've yet to discuss this, but we will be discussing this in the immediate future. Any quick questions about that? Otherwise, I'll just continue on.
Dan, one quick question. Could you repeat the dollar value of the application that will be available to or could be available to the district?
Sure. The potential value of the grant application is approximately 214,000 and change, give or take a dollar or two here or there. And that figure is taking this year's Title I allocation and 80% of that grant. At least that was the direction today. We'll know definitively, this Friday or Monday or Tuesday, but that's what they gave us as guidance if we wanted to estimate what our allocation would be.
Can I add a question to this as well? I believe we won't see all of that funds because I believe there has to be some pass through to private schools that are within our boundary as well as Devereaux.
Thank you.
Alrighty. In your packet, what I'd like to speak to first is the attachment that addresses the phased cut scenarios, and there are two phases here, and I'm going to begin with obviously phase one. In phase one, what we looked to do was to address non-personnel costs, breathing bodies, if you will. As you know, back in March 9th, the committee reduced this year's the FY21 budget by approximately $100,000. The increase for FY21 reflected an increase of approximately 4.2 above FY20. In looking at the cost, the first reduction that we're proposing, again, these are just proposals at this juncture, is looking to make a reduction of approximately $400,000 in the textbook line for FY21. And this reduction, if it were to hold, would reflect an almost 10% increase in the overall allocation to instructional support. The second reduction that we're proposing is in operations and maintenance of approximately $70,000. What we would look to do is to take savings from FY20, and as I had mentioned at a previous meeting, and to fill our tanks by June 30 of this year. I've also mentioned that we have submitted an application with MEMA, and we're hopeful that the cost we've identified, approximately $26,000, would be reimbursed, and that would go towards helping us to perhaps pre-buy supplies and materials with this year's money for next year. Thus, the reduction in approximately $70,000. Pupil services, there's a nominal reduction there to, in essence, reflect the increase that we had built in for FY21. In terms of the new positions, and this is a fairly large figure here, we're in essence taking all the new positions off the table. And again, this is just the proposal. And between the new positions and the benefits, we're looking at approximately $650,000. And that figure is broken out, assigning new positions approximately $565,000, and then $85,000 for the benefits assigned to that reduction there. The next recommendation is to look at excess and deficiency. Right now, we have available an excess and deficiency, approximately $963,000. I would recommend that, and again, this issue for FY21, this is a multi-year issue. This is FY21 and FY22. If, and again, the key word is if, we look at the use of excess and deficiency to support the 21 budget, and we are recommending approximately $450,000. But again, that is pending school committee support and approval of that. We're also looking to bring forward approximately $150,000, and that's an estimate, in FY20 school choice receipts, where we're estimating that our school choice figures for FY20 approximately $370,000. To accomplish that end, we would need to make some adjustments where charges have already been made to school choice, and we would back those out of school choice and back those back into the general fund for FY20. So that's a goal, and that's a goal that I'd like to realize by next week. And as I've identified in the far left-hand corner, those are target dates in which these actions will be accomplished. Circuit breaker, we've talked about this in previous discussions, and we're looking to bring forward approximately $400,000 in FY20 circuit breaker to assist us with tuition payments for next year. And we've already made those adjustments, excuse me, between circuit breaker and the general fund. So that's a pretty firm number. But we'll be looking to see what other adjustments that we can make to bump up that estimated carry forward. And contracted services, and this is across the board in the general fund next year, both regular ed and sped, to make an adjustment of approximately $100,000 based upon year-to-date activity prior to going out in the middle of March. And then we'd be looking at a savings for the SPED summer program, again, on the premise that that would be running remotely this summer, we'd be looking to save approximately $125,000. The subtotal here with these proposed reductions is $2,346,517. And again, these are proposals. These are recommendations coming forward. Phase two. Phase two, we then look at positions across the board. And for us to get to approximately 4.4 million in reductions, we'd be looking at making reductions from across the board again of $2.1 million. And that would be just short of 46 FTEs for FY21. And with those reductions, approximately $2.1 million, we would have exceeded the increase by approximately 183,000. So we could scale back some reductions, for example, in the personnel reductions by that value of approximately $183,000. There are other scenarios to look at, and we haven't drilled down on those yet. But with these two proposed phased adjustments, where we're looking at, in terms of the FTEs, just under 53 FTEs, 52.75, and reduction of cost of 4.4 million, $4,462,267. And again, these are our first take at making these reductions here. I'm going to stop there for a second, Mike, and be happy to entertain any questions. Otherwise, I will continue forward.
Yeah, I mean, we pause here. I'm sure you're going to have plenty of questions, but it probably makes sense to stop here for a moment. I guess, one quick question. The 4.4, and I think you mentioned the scale back to, a little bit to get to the 4.3, represents the difference between the fiscal 21 and the fiscal 21 budget that was passed by school committee and the fiscal 20 budget that we have for this year. Have we taken into account any of the cash flow differences based on the limitation of being only able to spend 1/12 budget in a particular month, and what kind of impact that might have on the total budget?
Right. So today, for example, again, looking at state revenue, what we heard today is that it is very much an unknown at this point. We are looking at the issue of cash flow. What comes into play is, especially as we get into the month of September, is what positions, what can we afford? Certainly, July, given past history, would not be an issue. August would get a little bit tighter, but as we get into the fall, it would get tighter. I believe in our previous meeting, I did share a draft of a scenario, and we are revising those figures, and I'll have those for you at our next discussion.
Okay, yeah, as I recall, the draft that you shared with us was based on last year's calendar, and while that's helpful just in terms of understanding seasonality between summer months and the fall, the value of the exercise that it sounds like you're in the middle of is understanding at what point does our salaries plus expenses exceed what we can expend in a given month, and when does that hit? And oftentimes that can happen when you have 3 payrolls in a particular month, for example. And so understanding, if that hits earlier or later certainly could have an impact to the overall budget. So we'll await that information. There were a few people who had hands raised in the chat. So let me go to Carl, who had a question.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is looking at, kind of taking a look at the other sheet that you had sent out. After kind of the personnel side of things, our next, like really the next big piece of the pie is when we're looking at transportation. Do we have any options, kind of any room in our contract that we could, like for example, say, yeah, we'll be content, or we'll go with an option to have fewer buses run, acknowledging that that's going to mean some longer rides because buses are going to be driving around more to pick up more kids. But would there be an option that we could do something with that to maybe lessen a little bit of the cut to personnel? I haven't seen the contract, so I don't know if that's something that we could look at doing. But I mean, if so, that might be another option as well, since at $7 million, that's our next biggest piece.
So the answer is yes. We can certainly reduce equipment per the contract. Secondly, we can certainly look at routes and see where we can make adjustments in any and all the routes. Thirdly, and I'm going to kind of jump ahead into into the second part of the conversation in terms of FY20. But as I mentioned in previous meetings, we have negotiated a settlement. Hasn't been signed yet for a home to school for this year. And I am looking to take those savings and make adjustments for this year that could help us for next year. Secondly, or fourthly, I apologize, in terms of transportation for 20, we've just begun discussions with our SPED providers now to make adjustments. And if I may, to jump ahead, again, staying with transportation, what I would be looking to do is with FY20 receipts, if receipts for FY20 for regional transportation exceeded what was required for paying for transportation, that we would then take that overage and make a deposit into the transportation revolving account that could assist us with transportation for FY21. In the discussion today, there was a question asked of Jay Sullivan of the DESI regarding regional transportation for FY20, and he was non-committal other than to say that the disbursement will be released prior to June 30 of 20.
And Dan, if I can just interject as well. Carl, that's a good question about looking at routes and so forth, but that's, one thing I can tell you is that, we've done that ad nauseum at our level with our bus providers, and not only AA, but also when we had McCarthy. And we're kind of maxed out. We're actually at a place where we could conceivably need more buses somewhere down the road. We actually had that as part of one of our budgets, or in the budget last year. So I would be hesitant to go in that route, but Dan's correct in the sense that there's always a possibility of renegotiating with the bus company.
All right, I had Jeff.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate all that information very much. With the buses, I wanted to throw this out. Two things that are completely contradictory, of course. One is, I would guess it's reasonable to expect that with COVID next year, there's going to be a need for more buses, not fewer, simply for the fact of trying to keep kids further apart. That's one idea. But then, before all this became the world that we know right now, I had a brief email exchange with Senator Goby, and my question was whether or not they had looked at recalculating the formula for our requirement of having to have a seat for everybody in the district, even though some of those kids never actually ride the bus. And I asked her if there was a way that that could be looked at, basically to make a smarter assessment of how much we really need in terms of the busing, because there are some kids who never ride. And she said, in fact, that that was actually happening, that there was discussion on that. Now, so that in theory could help us, but again, that was all before COVID became our new normal. And again, I go to the first point, which is that I would suspect, as people are trying to keep kids further and further apart, I don't see how fewer buses is going to work with that. Which leads me to my second kind of question, which is I've asked this of the School Committee Association. They don't know. I'm wondering if anyone else has heard. Does DESE have a timeline on when they are going to be putting out their guidelines for what needs to happen for reopening in the fall? Because, I mean, I've heard all kinds of things, one-way hallways, half occupancy, all people who have to do temperature checks, and of course, extra cleaning. All these things, of course, are going to mean extra money. And we're sitting here going through a list of things that we're going to have to cut. And these are all things that are going to actually cost more. And so I just wanted to know if DESE, as we're all sitting here trying to figure out what we're doing with our money and how to make this all work, it would be helpful to have some information about what those extra costs might be, or at least something to work with. And if they have an estimate on when they can get that to us, that would be useful, particularly if it comes before we finish the budget. I'm sorry. Let me just throw this last thing out real fast. I'll be done.
Yep.
And then I'll shut up.
Nope.
The last thing is that it looks like we're, well, I'll put it this way. State revenue supposedly is supposed to be on track for about 14% less next year. That's what I understand now. I don't know if that number's been changed, but I understand that revenues for next year are on target to be about 14% less than they are right now. The reductions that Dan just went over, thank you, Dan, for that. Those reductions reflect basically that 14% decrease of state aid. I'm talking about state aid. If there's a 14% decrease in state aid, my calculations show that would be about a $4.3 million hit. But if it's the 28%, I think Michael was talking about that earlier on. If it's tied to what happened 10 years ago, if it's more like the 28%, of course, that's an $8.5 million hit in terms of the state revenue. So are those the parameters that people are generally working with, saying, we're expecting somewhere in the range of a 14 to 28% reduction in state aid? Those are my questions. Thanks.
So Dan,
you.
before you jump in, let me just I think as we're going through this together, we're all kind of learning together too. But let me share and correct me if I'm wrong. Just again, some context. I think that we think about this. I think about this with three valves. The one valve is, we go into 1/12 budget and we go back to fiscal 20 funding levels. But that is more or less, I think, at an assessment level. The second valve is when you're in 1/12 budget, there's a timing impact. And so, I think we're still learning what the impact of that might be. The third valve, and I think this is somewhat distinct from the other two, is the local aid revenue. And so in my mind, the $4 million that we've walked through really represents the first valve. The third valve, which is any kind of decrease in state revenue, is something that I think we've yet to quantify and build into this model, other than I think that we've identified some opportunities where we can carry dollars forward from one year to the next to offset any shortfall that we would have expected from state revenue. Dan, do I have that about right?
That's correct, Mike.
Okay, so with that context, go ahead and speak to his questions.
So, Jeff, to your second question, I am not aware of any DESI guidelines for the areas that you addressed. I do have another call next week. I will certainly put that out there. As a matter of fact, I'll put it out there tomorrow as the DESI prepares the agenda for next week.
Dan.
And Darryl, I was going to defer to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can interject, I know I did. We had a meeting with the commissioner on Monday, and we actually reviewed this. So he has a task force that's been pulled together, comprised of a variety of constituents and representatives who are looking at reentry plans that would, as you said, Jeff, with a variety of options. One of the things that I'm doing, as well as I've tasked Director Keenan to work with a group that we are developing moving forward, in reference to how we're going to implement our reentry plan. One of the things that I'm concerned about is DESI taking its time, going through this process, and I think we really need to be on top of it because, again, we have a limited amount of time now. Summer's going to be upon us before we know it. And we're going to be planning either some type of remote learning, a hybrid model, or we're all going to be back and there's an inoculation or an immunization and everyone's going to be fine in September, which is not going to be the case. So we literally have to, lay out a variety of ways in which we can support this. So we're doing that at the local level, and that's going to get started next week. The state, we're hoping Dan and I have a meeting with MASBO and MASS next Thursday morning. So it's a joint meeting where I'm sure we'll have a lot of discussions around finances and so forth. But that's all we know right now.
And Dan, did you want to speak to Jeff's third question?
Yeah, and I think Darryl answered that, and I think I spoke of it earlier as well. We've received no guidance. I mean, the DESI doesn't know where state aid will be for FY21, and they spoke today of the likelihood that the state would be going into a 1/12 budget. But Jeff, also in this scenario that I presented, that we looked at real briefly at our last meeting, I gave a couple of different scenarios at Mike's request, showing a reduction of 90, revenues at 90% of the current year, 75 and 50. I'm looking to tweak that a little bit. I'm looking at 90, 85, 75, 70. And see where that gets us. So we're looking at those figures now.
And if I could just interject real quick as well, Dan referred back to the ERA funds back in 2008, 2009, and those funds were specifically designated to help offset the state revenue losses and so forth at that time. So again, there is talk of another bill going through where funding might be specifically targeted to municipalities and districts across the nation, which I am hopeful that goes through because, again, I think we're all in the same boat with this, and some of the districts who are even more dependent upon the state for their funding. I mean, there are districts that are in the 70, 80% of their funding comes from the state. They're going to have quite an issue starting in September as well.
Dan or Darryl, do we know when we went from the Great Recession, what the percent increase in state aid was back in 2008 to 2009?
I don't, Mike. I do know. Again, I was in a different district at the time, but the state at that time used some of the ERA funds to make up for the shortfall in Chapter 70 so that your Chapter 70 was whole. What was discussed today was that this grant application would not, at least as of now, impact FY20 Chapter 70, would not reduce it by the value of the grant, or for that matter, FY21. So a little bit different from what happened about 10 years ago.
Yeah, I guess number one, I mean, it seems to me that that's having that information as a reference point would probably be pretty useful. Number two, based on at least the information we had from historical perspective from Senator Gopi today, and talking about that there was a 28% reduction across the board in local aid back in 2008, 2019. A 28% reduction on $8 million is, or I'm sorry, on $30 million is about $8 million. Jeff had mentioned about half of that, or $4 million. Those are substantive and impactful numbers, and so having a little bit of history certainly might help us understand that a little bit. And I guess I'd say that pales in comparison on some portion of the $214,000 that we might get in a grant application. So again, understanding that third valve as it relates to state aid, while we probably won't have house numbers until July, but trying to understand, based on the information that's being given us and based on history, understand what's happened in the past and what that outcome could be, seems to me to be pretty useful. All right, I have Linda Long-Balil next in the queue.
Thank you. Yes, we had talked previously about about the fact that our bus company had applied for some of the Paycheck Protection Fund funds, and that we had agreed, or tentatively agreed, that if they got those funds, we would there might be some payment back to us, or that it might reduce our costs. And I have the same question about our special ed transportation companies. Any progress on that? Any updates on that?
So in the proposal that we have before AA Transportation, the president of the company does say that he will, if applicable, apply for those federal dollars. But if he does, that there would be an adjustment in payments made to the district. As of now, I'm not aware that he has made that application. And in terms of our SPED provider, we have one in particular who has a great deal of out-of-district SPED transportation. And we have just begun those discussions. They did submit a proposal to us, and Wachusett is working with another regional district, similar to the Home to School, where several districts got together to work on a resolve. And we're looking that again, no payments have been made to either the AA Transportation or the SPED providers, but it would be our stance that if these companies pursue these dollars, that once payments are made, that they would make adjustments back to us.
Is there any reason why they would not pursue these dollars? Have they indicated that they might not pursue these dollars?
Sure. In speaking with AA, and without getting into all the nuances in the weeds of those negotiations, what they had said to us a couple of weeks ago is that it was cumbersome, and problematic.
Right. Well, these kinds of processes usually are. But it could be real money. So I guess I would suggest that whatever pressure we can put on them to screw their courage to the sticking places and deal with the cumbersome, problematic process, I would suggest that we try to do that, and you probably already have. because that could definitely mean a meaningful adjustment in what we pay, and every little penny counts at this point. And
There is language, I'm sorry, Linda, there
ahead.
is language that is built into the draft agreement
Oh,
that addresses that.
to say that they must apply, or
No, that if they do
Oh.
apply, that our adjustments are made back to the district.
right, but it doesn't say that they must apply. It just says if they do. Is that right?
Right, if they choose
Yeah.
to.
If they choose to. Right. Okay. All right. I'm just saying that it would be, if there's any way to exert a little pressure or to encourage them, shall we say, render them technical assistance, whatever, to get them to apply for that money. I think it would be potentially worth trying. And the special ed transportation, have they suggested? Does it look likely that they'll apply, or are they worried about the same cumbersome, problematic process?
So we've only begun discussions with sped transportation
Mm-hmm.
providers, so I can't speak to where they're at with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then just a couple more questions. Is my understanding that there's no word yet on an early retirement package or potential package from the state? Are we still? So are we? Just remind me. Are we still waiting to hear from the state about that as a possibility? Or I can't remember if we said that we could make that decision independently or not. I'm sorry. Can you just
We can.
refresh my memory? We can. Okay, is that on
Yes,
the
we
table?
can. Everything's on the table. So,
Okay. All
so
right.
yes, that could be a discussion. We actually went back through. I had Jeff Carlson go back through and look at what we did back, I believe, in 2013. Jeff. So prior to me becoming superintendent, we did have some, an agreement that would pay staff funds if they agreed to, retire early. Not early, but agreed to retire.
Yeah.
There has been no word and no discussion from the state concerning this. Again, I think the last early retirement incentive that I can recall was probably back in 95 or 96, in all honesty. It was a long time ago.
Well, I know that state government workers had an early retirement package. I want to say it was back in 2015. It was under Deval Patrick.
Right. Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
But not public education.
I see. Okay. Yeah, because I have several really great people that worked for the state that I worked with retired, which is sort of unfortunate. But
right.
But anyway, okay. So that's still everything's on the table, including that. Okay, good to know.
Yep.
And then lastly, I know we had talked about a remote learning platform like Blackboard, for example. Have you had a chance? I know you've got a lot on your plate. Have you had a chance to start the process of costing that out and looking at how that might reduce some of our textbook costs? I know I use Blackboard at when I teach the medical school, and it is my understanding that if you put a document on Blackboard, all the students can look at it from Blackboard, and you don't have to buy multiple copies of things. That complies with copyright laws, and they don't have to buy multiple copies of things. We don't have to buy multiple copies of things for students to look at it. So there's one copy. It's on Blackboard, and so I was wondering if that might what the cost of Blackboard was, and what the potential offset in terms of textbook costs or other kinds of publications costs might be, if you'd had a chance to look at that.
So we haven't delved into that yet, because again, Google Classroom's free. So,
yes.
So the entire Google suite is free.
Yeah.
Blackboard's very expensive, and many colleges and universities have actually moved away from Blackboard because of the costs associated with it. And not a lot of K-12 schools use Blackboard because Google is free now.
Right.
But we can, we're definitely kind of exploring every single option. But I also know that there are copyright options associated with Google Classroom, or with it's basically the freedom to utilize and have students access copywritten information, but it's shared through that. There's a specific terminology that I know my wife uses at at her university as
Mhm.
well. But yeah, so we could look at that. There could be some cost savings there, Linda, but the costs associated with Blackboard would
Uh-huh.
be astronomical for 7,100
Oh.
kids.
Okay, that's helpful to know. So that makes sense. But and Google, I know Google Classroom is free, and I guess I didn't quite follow what you said about the copyright issues on or lack thereof on Google Classroom. Can you put, say, one document up on Google Classroom and have all the kids in a class access it without paying additional fees? How does that work? Do you know?
Well, again, you can do that. We always have to think about the copyright laws because that
Mhm.
does come out there. So
Mhm.
we're bound by those
Right.
legal obligations as well. But that's something that we could look at, and I think that's going to be again, everyone in the country is dealing with this right now. So
Yep.
this is kind of a test of how far I think publishers are willing to go in terms of going after school districts and so forth that
Right.
use these things online.
Right. Okay. All right. All right. I was just curious about that. All right. That's all my questions for now. Thank
Those are
you.
great
Great. I think I
questions.
have Malaya next.
Okay, we'll try. My son's off Xbox, so maybe this will work. I guess I would apologize. I was a couple minutes late, so if any of these are repeated, I'm sorry for that. My first question was a technical question for Dan about the document that he reviewed and the textbook reduction. I just wondered where that came from, and I apologize that I probably just missed that part. If that is just unused portion from this year, or if there are things we're not purchasing that we were planning to purchase, just wanted to clarify where that came from.
So I think, Bob, do you want to take that question? Bob
Yeah, I'd
B.
be happy to. These are some very tough discussions that we had internally, Malaya, and essentially what we came to the conclusion was we might have to put a lot of our textbook plan on hold for a year in order to minimize the impact to staff in that phase 2 of Dan's worksheet there. So what's in there? We have to buy some things because they're consumables and we need those each year. Some of those are in there, and that's primarily our math program. What else we decided in talking things over with Daryl was basically some of the things we're just mentioning now that Linda Longbelow brought up as well. We might have some costs on next year if we're going to go remote again in terms of apps or programs or online services or those types of things. One of those could be something to help us do maybe early reading remotely. Another thing might be how do we assess kids while we're remote, those types of things. So in thinking it through, we didn't want to chop all of the remaining money out of the textbook plan. So there's a little bit still left in there that allows us to move ahead with buying some of these online or remote programs that would help us with functioning as teachers while we're remote.
Does that impact the social studies curriculum, which I know was one of the big costs that we were looking at because of the new curriculum?
Yes, it might. That's one of those things.
That's a state requirement, so that was one of my questions.
Oh, you got that right, lady. Yeah, that's another reason. We didn't chop it to the bone. There's a little bit left in there, but essentially, for almost all the other things, we're putting things on hold for a full year. And this was really tough. It was a tough decision for us. But when you come down to eliminating a program or a teacher, I mean, that's where we're at right now.
Okay. I guess some of my other questions may be tied loosely to this philosophy, but I appreciate that. That's helpful. I just didn't know where to come from. My second related question, well, it's not textbook related, is the section about the summer program remotely. Has that decision been made definitely? Because I was not aware of that.
No, it hasn't.
No.
So
It's likely, but okay.
well, yeah, and so what we had to do, Malaya, is again, we're just projecting out what will most likely happen, but nothing 100% definitive. Will it most likely happen? Yes. It's but nothing final has been
okay.
Put
Just in
together.
case I was missing something, so I knew what was already anyways. Okay, I appreciate that. And my last question really has to do with all of the positions, and it's more of a question, so you may be planning to get to that as we go through the meeting. Actually, before I get to that, I'm going to ask Dan a question about the buses. Do we know do we have a deadline for getting an agreement signed from them? Because I know people in the public are talking about it, and the bus company has been promoting some legislation to help him get, well, not just him, help him get paid. There's some kind of thing around the paying people for not doing work that affects other districts. And there's chatter. So I didn't know if we have a deadline on our part for that amendment coming forth, so that we will have a definite answer on that.
So Malaya, there were 13 districts involved in the negotiations with AA. I know that one or two of them had questions after those were resolved. So I know that Ron is responding to them. I actually received an inquiry today. I know that Ron Ernenwein, who's the president of AA, wants to get this resolved ASAP. And if I may, Malaya, I think what you're referring to is there is legislation out there that would, for lack of a better word, tweak Chapter 41, Section 56, where in essence it would say, and I'm just paraphrasing what I've heard too, but I think this is what you're referring to, where districts across the board would be required to pay their bus provider because there are a number of districts. And we're negotiating a settlement, but there are a number of districts who are saying, "I'm not paying you anything."
Right. Okay. I appreciate that. That's beyond our control. I just didn't know from what we can control if we had if the deadline by which we could expect to reasonably have an answer or response. So that was my question, because all we can control is what we can control. So there is no deadline right now as to when we'll have a response, because it involves 13 districts, is what I heard you saying.
Well, as quickly as possible. I mean, I'm gonna nudge them along. I'd like to get at least our situation resolved immediately.
And there was no deadline in the agreement by which to respond to it.
No.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That is a good question. Yeah. Okay. And the last question, again, probably will go into other things, but it's more of a process question. In talking about things like all of the proposed positions and cuts in general, but specifically the positions and maybe things like textbooks. Do you have a process in mind, you and Daryl or other administrators, for how these will be discussed, so that we can see, which positions you're thinking of, how many of them are due to potential retirements, how many of them will directly impact programming, which may impact all sorts of things? Do you have a plan for providing that kind of level of detail so we can look at the big picture in more depth?
Yeah, so I'll answer that, Malaya. Again, one of the things we're looking to do is bridge this gap. So you have that 1/12 plan of action, and that's the $4.4 million deficit. And then we have to think beyond that, which is an exercise that Dan's working on. We already know, everything in between. So we had a quick conversation last week, and we were, basically looking at all the items we could cut prior to getting to people, and those are the items that we can cut. We were very careful and cautious, and again, we're a pretty thin budget to begin with.
We are,
and we're already short on materials and so forth. So again, Bob said it well. We spent an awful lot of time deliberating around the textbook plan and how to move forward with it. But one thing we have to remember is that we are going to probably need extra funds or more funds to deal with some of the technology issues that will most likely arise in the next year or two because of the COVID-19 situation. In reference to the staffing issues, I think one of the things we have to do is look at how best we can kind of support holding on to as many staff as possible. Yeah. So, quick and dirty, you can say, okay, it's 45 staff, 47 staff altogether. That gives you the dollar amount, the 2.1, 2.2. But the issue really comes down to, are there other cost savings that we can conceivably have through negotiating with
Right.
different places. And like someone asked about the bus company. Could we negotiate? Sure, we can negotiate. We can negotiate with anyone. So opening that
Right.
up, looking at our health insurance plan to see if there's a way that we can lower that dollar amount. So there are many different ways of doing it. We just wanted to put it out there. Here's a number of staff. This is how it kind of plays out. In terms of determining how that works, that's going to be a larger process.
I guess that's my question going forward. Now, I understand we're sort of in the beginning of it, but I also know there's a timeline for some of the other things you just talked about, like health insurance, or, if you were to look at any elements of the contract to see if we could save positions in other ways, with adjustments to things like cost of living increases and all of those things we've talked about hypothetically. Those things have a deadline. And so I guess I was not on the school committee the last time you did this, but I was a very careful observer from the community. And I know there was a lot of detail shared in those discussions. And now sitting on the Business and Finance Committee, we don't have that level of detail even on this committee. And so I just was curious about going forward, your plan to share more details so we can see, just like when we create the budget, we see exactly where you're planning to spend the textbook. So I'd logically like to see which of those areas you're planning to cut, just so we know programmatically, because that will affect things. And we were involved in approving the priorities that you started with, if that makes sense. And if you're looking at positions to cut, or hopefully not, but you're looking at that big picture, it would be helpful just to kind of know what you're looking at and how many are due to anticipated retirements and how many are bodies in the schools that are going to affect things like class size, or if there's, special education positions that are being cut or whatever, or if you're like, oh, well, we may have to cut our music staff in half or whatever you're looking at. We really don't know, sitting in our position right now, what those are. And I think as we go forward, I was curious about your process for discussing some of that, because ultimately, I don't know the big picture, but I know in the past when we've had to make significant cuts, there have been discussions on that level, trying to save as many positions as we can, but also knowing and understanding the programmatic impacts that we're ultimately agreeing to with any revised budgets. And so I hope that sitting in the Business and Finance Committee, we would be able to consider that information and all of the things you guys are talking about. So I was curious from a process standpoint, how you envision this playing out from a process standpoint. And as I said, you might get to that as we go through, but that was my concern.
Thank you, Malia. So Daryl, before you answer, I just want to remind folks who are on the call that if you're not speaking, if you can go ahead and put your line on mute, because we do have some feedback that's coming through other people's lines. So with that, Daryl, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mike. So Malaya, one of the things that we, were attempting to do, this is a little different than the past in terms of how this has worked out. So I can say, I lived through 2008 and 2009 here, and it was a slow burn in terms of how the budget kind of worked. We knew it was kind of happening as it kind of went through the process, and it started really early on in the year. It was like September, October. That's when the crash happened. So we had a lot of time to plan it out. We had a lot of time for discourse. So all of that did happen. And then even as we've gone through more challenging budget times, we're talking about smaller numbers. I'm not talking, $4 million reduction. So that's why, when I'm looking at this, we're trying to be cognizant and careful of what we're kind of talking about internally and then externally. Because again, I've not sat down with any of the unions yet and talked about where we might be. We wanted to put this out there. Here's a dollar amount associated with this number of people. This number of people equals a certain number of administrators, teachers, custodians, cafeteria. You name it, that they're in there somewhere. And we just have to kind of make sure that we're doing this in a way that's sensitive to all of the people who work in this district. Because again, I'm leading this district in a very tough time, and I want to ensure that I'm doing so with a certain amount of compassion and understanding that people's livelihoods are at stake right now, and I completely understand that. So yes, there will be more details.
I do as well.
Yep. Yes, we will have all that, and we just have to make sure that we follow a process where I'm giving everyone proper kind of notification and
Yeah.
understanding and conversation associated with some of the other options that we've been talking about.
And I guess I understand that completely. I'm not suggesting you tell us everything, but I don't even know what that process you're envisioning is and where you are in that. So that's why I was asking the question. Just, you know, things like talking to the unions obviously has to happen, but thus far you haven't told us you're doing that, so we have no idea. So that's why I asked the question, that really, even those details, we don't know what you're thinking. And again, like with the textbooks, we don't know. I'm glad Bob mentioned what some of those areas are. I'd love to just see the quick list, just so we have it for reference, because we spend so much time creating the budget and approving it in great detail, to see the things that you're thinking of taking out of it, just so we know what they are, so we can wrap our head around it before we get to the final whatever. So we can wrap our head in it in the pieces by which you're considering it. It would be helpful. So I was more curious about the process and the pieces that you're envisioning going forward. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay. I have Ken Mills next.
Thanks. I think to some degree, Member Gustafson, you know, said some things that I was thinking. You know, I think the textbooks and the bus negotiations are important, but they are a little bit bearing the lead on the number that we talked about. And there are some deadlines that, you know, we have in mid-June to make those decisions. So, you know, I'd encourage superintendent to, you know, continue conversations, but we do, of course, have to do them quickly. So that, you know, I think part of being sensitive to people is being straightforward and transparent too, right? Even when those conversations are hard. And you know, I just encourage us to be transparent, straightforward, honest, compassionate, all of those things. But the lack of honesty and transparency isn't compassionate either, right? It's so I think we need to be sensitive in that way, and follow a process that is timely. And it's something we can continue to talk about, you know, but in the week or so to come, not in the months or so to come.
Thank you, Ken. You know, and I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment, and I think that's the spirit of, you know, trying to have this meeting and what I suspect will be future meetings, and, you know, certainly understanding, you know, there is a level of being able to go from X number of FTEs to the types of categories of positions, and how you get to that reduction, to ultimately, you know, who does that mean on a person-to-person level. And I think what I'm hearing is, you know, there is an appetite for this committee to understand that process, and to have information, not at a granular person-to-person level necessarily, but as a categorical level, or as that gets refined. There's a couple of second questions that have come through that I'll get to them, and I did a couple questions that I wanted to use before we get into a second round of questions. And, you know, part of it is I wanted to, again, just set a baseline for, we're doing this exercise with the likelihood that we go into 1/12 budget, and what that means, and what that doesn't mean. And so, you know, we've gone through this in previous years, and 1/12 budget means, in effect, that the state is going to, DESE is going to set a budget for the district that will likely be equal to the budget that we had for fiscal 20. But that more or less is from an assessment perspective. You know, what that doesn't mean is that if we were to decide, for example, that we wanted to modify our budget at the last minute and put in E&D, that we can just add E&D onto that 1/12 budget. That the savings that we're pulling forward are things that we can use on top of the 1/12 budget. 1/12 budget is 1/12 budget. And, you know, so that is a spending cap. But again, you know, and I think it's an important distinction to point out, that, you know, when we go in the 1/12 budget, there will be corresponding assessments that are made to each town. They'll pay on the schedule that they ordinarily pay on. Those assessments will be based on the new calculations of of local contribution. But then there's still the question of state aid. And so to me, these areas that we're trying to pull forward funds from fiscal 20 into fiscal 21 are funds that we are trying to use to largely mitigate against funding that it would have expected to be there even last year in fiscal 20 numbers. That's not going to be there, could potentially not be there. And so, I guess I'm making that statement as a statement and not a question, but I'd like for someone like Dan to affirm that in fact is the case and our common understanding.
That's correct, Mike. Again, given the information that has been shared with us, we're not looking at any reductions in 20. We're not looking at any reductions in our Chapter 70. We're not looking at any 9C cuts, for example, that would impact regional transportation. There is the unknown with Medicaid. In our previous meeting, I did project out what I thought our receipts would be, excuse me, for FY20. But we've yet to receive final determination from UMass and consequently Mass Health, where we're not aware of any adjustments in terms of our charter reimbursements. So because of that information, I'm able to project out that, for example, for our circuit breaker, we're projected to get 2.8 million this year after it's all said and done. And of that 2.8, we're hopeful we're planning to bring forward 400,000. FY21, though, as Jay Sullivan again affirmed today, is a huge unknown. It is a huge unknown. Chapter 70, regional transportation, circuit breaker, the SOA. The SOA is a huge unknown as well.
Okay. So, going back to the question of E&D and as you reviewed your list with us, there was a recommendation, although I'm not sure how firm that recommendation was based on some of your language, but there was a recommendation of potentially building 450K into or from E&D and bringing that forward. And I guess I'm not sure if what you meant was bringing it forward or rebuilding a budget or. So I guess my question is, hearing you say that this is likely a multi-year issue, understanding that we have less than $1 million in E&D, where certainly last year and probably this coming year we're going to be flying close to the sun on landing the plane. That's not to say it's lack for any effort, right? It's just to say that it is what it is. It's not like we're putting a lot of money into E&D. So, what is your gut on allocating E&D and what's the mechanism if we do allocate it to bring that to bear for next year?
So in the original 21 budget that was approved by school committee, E&D wasn't allocated, and we had discussions in previous committee meetings about that. Given where we're at now, that's correct. We're under $1,963,000 and change. And as I had stated earlier in this meeting, we need to be mindful. I need to remind the committee that this issue is not only an issue for 21, but also for 22. Similar to what happened approximately 10 years ago. It was an issue in 09 and 10, and only in 11 did districts in the state come out of the woods with that issue. So my in this work here, and at the recommendation of Darryl, we took a sum of money, which is approximately $450,000, to make the adjustments for 21. I certainly, my gut, if you will, I wouldn't go above that. That gives you the better part of 450 and change to use for 22. But we're recommending that because as we've talked about in this discussion here, E&D, like so many other things here, if you will, that goes away come June 30. So to reserve a sum of money from the FY19 approved E&D, whatever that value is, that decision would need to be made prior to June 30 of 2020. Otherwise, that goes off the table. To reserve a sum of money for 21 would have to happen before June 30. So there is some urgency to make a determination if we use that, if at all.
Yeah. So, just to be clear, I agree with the latter part of what you just said. When we say that the money goes away, that's not literally true, right? I mean, the money goes up for recertification, and so there's a verification process. But if we want to use those funds, and I think this is your point, in fiscal year 21, it seems to me there's two pathways to do that. One pathway is that we need to reissue a new budget to specifically build this into a fiscal 21 budget that we send to the towns, which is an interesting exercise, right? Because I'm not sure what other kinds of changes we would make. The other process is to seek to use those funds in this fiscal year and repurpose those funds through school choice and roll that forward in the fiscal 21. So have you given any thought to, and maybe there's a path 3 that I don't know about, but have you given any thought to Daryl's recommendation, how to effectuate Daryl's recommendation to use that $450K for next year?
So to your second point, Mike, and I believe we spoke about this briefly at our last meeting, to take a sum of money, and we'll just say it's $450,000, and use that for the FY20 budget, and thus enabling us to carry forward school choice, for example. That would have to follow the same guidelines as was the case last year when we used $250,000 for the field at the high school, in essence giving the towns 45-day notice of the use of that. It is possible. It would be a fairly tight deadline. Daryl, did I miss anything in that piece there?
No, you're correct. You're right, Dan.
Yep.
So is it your intention that you're going to resubmit a new budget less $450,000 in order to include it in E&D?
So ultimately, I think that was something that we should have a conversation about, which is why we brought this forward. So when Dan reviewed this, we wanted to bring forward, here are the variety of options that we have available to us in order to meet this 1/12 budget for FY21. Tapping into E&D, we can do that, and we would need to make that recommendation to lower the budget before the end of June, and that would have to go forward. I think that would go a long ways with the towns, in all honesty, because we have heard, I've heard from people not on the streets, but around, basically saying, what are you sitting on all of your excess and deficiency this year? How are you going to help the towns out? Those types of things. I think this is it's a good way to do it, especially as Dan mentioned. You're right, Mike. The money doesn't go away. We just don't have access to it until it gets certified again, and that could be, gosh, Dan. Typically, it doesn't happen for 7 or 8 months. Correct?
That's correct. I mean, we can certainly, push it up. But typically in the fall, a lot of the towns and cities are looking to get their free cash certified. But we could certainly throw our hat into the mix. But I don't think that DOI would put us at the top of the list for certification in the fall.
Yeah. So today is May 6th. I think that we need to, at least let Desi know that we look like we're going to go in the 1/12 budget by June 1st. But tonight we've talked about several different options, whether that be, renegotiating bus contracts, looking at health insurance, looking at submitting a new budget with the E&D enclosed. All of those have time properties. If we submit a new budget, we need to give our towns 45 days to be able to review that budget, as I understand from a revised budget.
Mike, I apologize. I did reach out to the DESI a couple of weeks ago with that question, and if we were to resubmit a reduced budget, there is a window. It's actually 30 days.
Okay.
It's 15 days. Well, 15 days is 15 days that we would have to get the towns to look at that. And I did get that, and that's an opinion that I received from DESI Legal today, so we could run with that if we had to.
Yeah, this looks good. So 45 days is in the regs, an opinion is 30 days. But the point of this is that there's time values to each of these, and I think as the administration's continuing to look at options, and I feel like we're in the middle of that exercise. We probably need to understand and share with this committee at what point do our options start to go away because we've lost the value of time sensitivity. And so if there are things that we need to decide upon and the school committee needs to decide upon, such as whether or not it makes sense, given the vast unknowns that are out there, to resubmit a new budget, then that's something we should be talking about pretty quickly before that avenue or window of possibility closes. So the last thing that I'll say, again, is I go back to, the way that I'm thinking about it, and with Mayor, hopefully it's helpful to others in terms of these three valves, and the first valve being, back to fiscal 20 levels, which is about $4 million. The second valve being a cash flow issue on 1/12 budget, which we're still trying to understand what that might be. Let's call it $1 million. And the third valve being a reduction in state aid of some number. And the only guideline that we have so far, without knowing what this impact was, the last time we had a major event, economic recession, at least Senator Gopi is saying the last time from across the board was 28%, which was, in our terms would equate to an $8 million problem. So, we have from the budget that was passed, and again, it's starting to sound like a cliche. You plan for the worst, you hope for the best, but potentially anywhere from a $4 million to a $13 million issue. And I think that we need to continue to look at it in those terms and understand and gain some granularity around what the dollar value of those valves are. And what that means for us going forward. So, having said that, I saw, Ken, you had a question related to the budget, and then we'll go back to Jeff.
So one option that was mentioned was this idea of presenting a new budget to the towns, and I want to ask a simple question just to make sure that I'm understanding it, and I apologize if I'm wrong. We send a budget to the town. We set two numbers, if I understand it correctly. We set the budget over which we can't spend, and we send assessments to the towns. So that is presuming that the difference between our budget and the assessments is what we're getting in state aid, other revenue, whatever. Since we don't have any idea what that number is, if we were to send a revised budget to the towns that had a lower budget, but the same assessments, we're taking, in my mind, a massive risk, right? That we would be the ones making up any delta there when we just don't know the information. Like, we don't know what the delta should be because we don't know what, we only know, all I feel we could change is the total. I don't feel that since we don't know state aid, we can't give the assessment. So I appreciate that we want to make a change. I just think that there's the way I understand it, and I could be wrong. We could be taking a massive risk by having towns approve their assessment, approve our budget, when we don't have enough information to know what the assessment should be. Anyway, so maybe I'm misunderstanding that, and please correct me if I'm wrong.
That's correct, Ken. We don't know what our state aid will be whatsoever. We don't know what the MLC will be, and all of those figures are factored into the assessments for the town. We could make an assumption. We could take the state aid figures that were originally presented, and we could reduce them by 20%, 25%, and run with that. But then we run the risk that what if state aid is reduced 15% or 10%? Unlikely, but what if? There is a gamble there, yes.
Okay, I have Jeff next up.
Okay, thanks. There was a while back we were talking a little bit about thoughts on what might be needed expenditure-wise in terms of technology for remote learning, apps and in lieu of textbooks, that kind of thing. So that was a good segue for a question I had with Daryl and Barry. Daryl's ready for it. He's ready. I wanted to know where we stand with the computers. Barry had said that in rough numbers, his best guess was that there were approximately 500 kids in the district who didn't have a Chromebook, either in terms of like not having a computer at home that they were using, or that they weren't assigned by the school. And then out of that 500, I believe about half they have been covered by loan outs from the district. So obviously, if remote learning is going to be an issue next year, which if I were a betting man, I would say it is, where do we stand? Do we have enough? If it is in fact 500, do we have enough right now to loan out to kids next year to cover that?
So we could do that. And again, when we're talking about those numbers, we were talking about trying to get them out to pretty much everyone across the board. So, looking at that, we have carts in our schools. So, this would give us time to pull everything out. We'd be able to we'd have to realign how we have kind of rolled out this technology plan over the past 3 or 4 years. We'd have to jump ahead probably 7 or 8 years by going in this direction. But we can do it. And Barry's pretty confident that again, we've been able to do this in a pretty short time frame. If we have a little longer time frame, over the summer, pull the carts apart, cannibalize certain machines that we know are old and need to be basically recycled. Take new ones that are coming in. Ensure that we have all of them coming back through. So we're going to have we're going to have a process where we're bringing a lot back in, we're revamping them, and then we're getting them back out. But we'll have enough.
That was the key thing. Okay, thank you. Because to buy 500 of those, I think is somewhere around $110,000. So it was important to know.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right, I have Linda.
Yes, getting back to the point that Malia made about COLAs. I did first of all, I'd like to just note that at the medical school, we are not going to have our 2% COLA next year. They've taken that off the table. At some point, perhaps it'll be restored, but at the moment, it's off the table. Technically speaking, they call it a merit increase, but really, it's a COLA. So I did a little quick and dirty calculation in Excel, and based on the budget, the second budget that we approved last year, or not last year, but for FY21, minus the $100,000 that we cut, the 2% COLA would add up to $1.3 million, which is a pretty sizable chunk of change and a meaningful portion of the shortfall that we may be facing this year. So I do think that that is something that is worth seriously considering. And I understand that there need to be negotiations with the unions and that sort of thing, but I hope that we will really look at that very seriously. Something else that they're doing at the medical school is that individuals above a certain salary threshold are being required to take mandatory vacation days. I think that gets those vacation days off the books as an expense. I think that's why they're doing that. And I don't know if that's something that we've looked at. I mean, it only affects people who are relatively high earners, and there are a lot more high earners at the medical school than there are in the school district by far, I'm sure. But I just wondered if that was something that had been at least considered.
I know. I think Linda, we talked about that a couple weeks ago. We haven't necessarily looked at primarily because we don't have a lot of staff who have vacation time to begin with.
Right.
Most of us, there are. It's a small percentage who work year round. In the district, most of our employees, work the 183-day schedule or 180-day schedule.
Right. Okay. Well, that makes sense. Okay. All right. And as I said, I do hope that you'll look very seriously at the 2% COLA issue, because that could definitely save us some real meaningful amount of money. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I saw, so Heidi Lay, who's the president of WREA, is on the call, and she had a remark or comment earlier on, so I wanted to give her an opportunity to make it or ask a question.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. I listened, and there were several members who mentioned the impact of the cuts and how could we reopen school, and maintain social distance and have more bus routes and address the concerns of our students, their emotional, social, and their learning gaps. And I don't think we can do it unless we actually get the kind of bailout that they had no problem giving to corporations. So it really disturbs me. I understand that our instinct is we have the money that we have and we want to look at cuts. But I can tell you right now that the Mass Teachers Association is going to go after the kind of public education bailout that they had no problem giving to corporations right out of the bat, because this entire generation of children will be negatively impacted if we go down the road of inadequate funding for public education. These cuts coming off of a 6-month potential gap in face-to-face learning with additional remote learning and the social emotional impact on children is going to be unsustainable. Our children deserve the investment of our public education. There are tax dollars, and they should be going towards our children and the public good, and not towards Boeing and all of the large companies who should have and could have committed their resources to weathering the storm, something that we don't have the same financial option to do. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We'll come back to Malaya.
All right. Sorry, I had a technical issue. My question is actually not unrelated to what Heidi said. It was when you were talking about the staffing, one of the questions that's gone through my head is, have we considered the impact that we will have possibly increased funds if we are increased costs, if, for example, we need additional staffing for things that some things we've talked about, like temperature checking, or if we need to stagger teachers or add more staff or more learning time, or whatever this looks like when we come back, may need an increase in staffing. But also the other thing that went through my mind is if this is in our communities for some time, teachers will be getting sick and staff will be getting sick, and we may need increased funds for substitutes and things like that. So I don't know if that factored into our budget discussions thus far as well.
Yeah, I can tell you, Malaya, those are conversation points that we've had. We're purely looking right now at the defined areas in which we would suggest making reductions. How that kind of plays out moving forward is going to be a challenge, just because we're not sure what it's going to look like, what the expectations will be around transportation. Alone, with the whole concept of social distancing on a bus. There aren't enough buses in Massachusetts to provide that type of support. In all honesty, they're not there. There really isn't a way. They'd have to not just stagger. They'd have to break our school day up into thirds in order to do that. So that would be a challenge. Or kids would go to school 2 days a week and have 3 days at home. All of those types of things are the things that Commissioner Riley has been talking about with their task force. Those are the things that we have to think about internally as a group as well. So, yeah, I mean, we can add extra money for those, but I don't know what it would be, which is one of the reasons why we can make a certain amount of reductions, but we need to still keep buffers in there, because if we don't, it's just going to mean more probably staff ultimately, because there aren't other things that we can cut.
Which is ironic, because the things I talk about, I just mentioned, would require more staff, not less staff, to do the same work we've been doing. So
I know.
I'm kind of at a loss how that all fits in and how we do that. I know other states have been talking about some of what you just did. I have a friend who lives in, I've lost track, but I think it's North Carolina. It might be Michigan. I've lost track, but I have friends all over the country, and one of their school districts just today mentioned that they would be doing just that and having their kids come 2 days a week and doing remote learning the rest of the week, so they could stagger who comes in when. And that's all they know right now. I honestly, I'm sorry, I don't remember which state it was, but there are states doing that, and whatever it comes to will probably require more staff rather than less. So I guess that's a great unknown, but also a concern as we're talking about staffing. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
All right, I have Carl next.
Sorry, I didn't hit the wrong button there. So question on kind of, and this is a little more, I guess, like a process in regards to staffing. So say if we were to like move forward and come up with a really gloomy rainy day budget that would be like based on some projected state cuts, and so we'd have to get to a budget of say like 85 million, and of course that's like serious cuts and all that, and so we kind of step through and we do that, and then down the road, so like October, November, December, something like that, this additional like bailout, additional funds come from the federal government, whatever, and our budget were to be moderately plussed up from those types, like would we even be able to like hire additional teachers and change things around like once we're in the school year? Like, I mean, because like we want to get closer to kind of the class sizes that we're aiming for, but like if we are in a situation where we're having to make draconian cuts across the board, and then later on down the road, like once we're already into the school year, more revenues are coming in that would allow us to bring back some of these educators that we've lost. Like, would we even be able to do something like that? Where, because you'd be like, you've got a teacher that has 35 students in their classroom, and now we're able to bring someone in, but now you have to break up a classroom and rejigger schedules. And I would think it could be done, but it sounds like just another logistical nightmare on top of another nightmare that's already buried within another nightmare on top of itself. And again, it's like, and it kind of goes back to what kind of what was mentioned earlier of like planning for the worst and hoping for the best. And that's kind of like part of hoping for the best when you're planning for the worst, is that maybe down the road we get some more money, we can kind of get closer to where we'd want to be budget wise. But they're like, once the school year starts, some of it, even if all of a sudden the magic money fairy shows up and says, oh, here's an extra $10 million, the practicalities of putting that into play is much more challenging once the year starts.
Carl, I agree. You know, especially with the nightmare within a nightmare within a nightmare. But that was a great way to frame this. But there are definitely ways in which you know, if we had, you know, severe cuts and we were all of a sudden we were you know, money was shared with us by the state or for the federal government, however it worked out, we would definitely be able to look at adding staff midstream. We'd do exactly as you said. We'd split classes up that were large. We'd have to change schedules around for kids. Would it be hectic and challenging? Yes, but I think a teacher would much rather say, okay, you know what, I'm more than willing to reschedule if I can go from having 150 kids down to 100 kids, or if I can go from having a class of 37 down to a class of like 18, 19. So I think, you know, there are going to be some gives and takes with those, but we would definitely do that. You know, also if we did have those types of funds, you can always buy ahead for the following year because we don't know what we're going to be dealing with in FY22. So there are ways in which you know, you can plan it out essentially. But we could do that, and we have done that in the past where we've added staff, you know, midstream. It's not fantastic, but it's doable.
All right, I have Ken Mills again.
So first off, I wanted to appreciate Ms. Leahy's comments about the securing more funding. I think that's important, and I think it falls into the plan for the worst and advocate for the best. Maybe to slightly change what Mike's phrase was about, you know, hope for the best. And we definitely need to do that concomitantly with our planning for the worst. And a Boston School Committee put out a resolution that we should consider our version of calling for that sort of aid. In terms of planning and timing, you know, I encourage going back to something Dan mentioned earlier when there was a conversation about early retirements. I know retirement and leaving the districts is different, right? The retirement is between the retirement board and the teacher, what they're eligible to do or not. We can't help with that part, but whatever we can do to have, if we have to reduce our numbers, to do it in a way where we're not letting people go. It's the right thing to do because they're our people and we care about them. Two, also, if we have to start letting people go, Tom, way back when, used to talk about the 3 for 2 calculation. And since we have to pay unemployment for people that are let go, which we don't want to do anyway, because it's not the thing we want to do, it's actually pretty expensive to do that. So I don't know if Dan factored that into the cost of his assumption when he came up with that number of what was there.
That's a 3 for 2 model, Ken. So
okay.
That was factored in. You know, one thing again that we've spoken about is just the concept of attrition, and that's something that we've done, you know, in this district for many years. So looking at the retirements that we have this year, how might we go about, you know, looking at whether or not we have to fill all of those positions? Because again, as you know, it wouldn't require us to, you know, lay someone off or do something like that. So there are other ways for us to look at this as well.
Blair?
All right, finally figuring this out. Okay, so I have another process question, which again, you may get to later, but now it is kind of later. Regarding the overall budget, I know that before COVID, we had one town that indicated they would be unlikely to be able to recommend passing the budget due to their budget situation before COVID. And since COVID, we have had 2 towns specifically send letters saying they cannot recommend passing it or would like us to use it because their town finances are so unstable. I don't know if we have formally heard from the others, but that is 3 of our 5 towns. So from a practical standpoint, I'm curious, I mean, we have to make some decision about moving forward at some point. So I'm curious what sort of thinking or plan we have. I know we don't have a lot of numbers, but that's 3 towns that have indicated that they either that they cannot support our budget in these uncertain times, and one of them was before the uncertain times. So I'm just curious, do we have a deadline at which we will decide whether we're going to submit a formally new budget to them? Or are we going to let the town meetings play out and then come back to it, which is fine. But I'm just thinking about that in the back of my head, that that's sort of a process question that we need to probably decide. And if the decision is to let them just kind of play out and see where we land, and hope we have more information by then, that's fine. But in the back of my head, that's 3 of our 5 towns who have said that they can't really support our budget. I'm sure the 2 are not really in any better position.
So, I can tell you, Malaya, remember, in terms of this budget, we want to, I think Ken said it. This is a challenge. It's a challenge for us to lower this budget because we're not sure where we're going to be. And we're not going to have any idea where we are on June 22nd, probably either. So, we're going to go into this. It is.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to be in a situation where we're going into it without any information that will probably help us, really lower this, put us in a situation where we can accurately develop a new budget that would be sustainable by 4 of the 5 towns. And I believe towns are probably
and they
in
don't
the
know
same,
either.
Exactly. They're in the same boat. So they're in the same situation. The state's going to be in the same situation. There's not going to be a state budget, at the end of June.
So are we just are we basically defaulting to letting it play out as it may, and then knowing we'll have to revisit all of this in the fall, which is fine. I just didn't know formally if that's what we're doing.
Well, I think that's a decision that has to be made. Again, this budget is the school committee's budget. So that would be a decision that would be made at the school committee level. I could make a recommendation in reference to how we might do this and what we might, do. So it's definitely something to consider. So yes.
Okay.
So, just to step in there, I do think, part of the reason why we're having, the last meeting, the focus was around the same topic. The meeting before that was intended to be around the same topic. This meeting around the same topic really is to get an understanding from the administration about, what your thinking is and what it is that you would recommend. And, using this committee as a vehicle for being able to, if nothing else, at least being a sounding board for some of the pathways that you might think about. So, if I have some thoughts for the end, but I guess my point is that if you're thinking that this is something that we ought to take up, this being submitting a new budget, seems to me this is the place, this is the time, and if this isn't the time, then hopefully it's pretty soon to talk about it. We'd like to hear what the recommendations are. We'd like to know what the thinking is, why it makes sense, what's the evidence that we think it's going to be valuable to all those involved, and let's move on with it. Okay, I think I have Linda and then Jeff.
Just quickly, I would like to see what the cost of furloughs would be versus the cost of layoffs. It's my understanding that if we furlough people, at least they can keep their benefits, their health insurance, et cetera, and we are in the middle of a pandemic. So I would really like to see some numbers on that at some point soon, just so we have all options on the table.
So Linda, you would want to see what the cost would be associated if we furloughed, let's say, 10 people versus laying off 10 people?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, that would be a fairly easy calculation for you, correct?
You mean Dan?
No, Jeff would do it through, Jeff would be working on that through HR.
Oh, I
Yes,
see.
I can
Okay.
look at that tomorrow.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I'll take a look at that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
And then we have Jeff.
Thank you. I appreciate Ken's point about the uncertainty of the state money. And so if we set a budget and then we set a budget, we set the assessments, and then the state money is or is not what we expected, and the wrinkles that can cause, I totally appreciate that. But wouldn't that also be the same case with the 1/12? I mean, aren't we essentially doing that in a 1/12 scenario as well? I mean, there's still going to be an assessment sent to the towns, and it would seem to me that a 1/12 budget would also have a built-in assumption of what the state revenue would be too, and so we could still wind up in the same scenario, I think, where the uncertainty of the state revenue could cause the same sort of headaches, whereas if we were to create our own. Am I wrong on that?
So Jeff, let me or Dan, before let me take a shot at that because I want to validate my understanding as well. So first of all, yes, we do have uncertainty from a state funding perspective while we are in 1/12 budget. But 1/12 budget is a temporary measure. And you can only be in 1/12 budget, and the implication is that we as a district are trying to pass a budget
Right.
along the road up through that point. But you can only be in 1/12 budget until December 1st, and if we can't come to an agreement with the towns, then the commissioner will set the budget for the rest of the year for us. But what happens in between that time? In between that time, we get clarity into what the state numbers ought to be. So there's a timing difference here. The timing difference is we will not likely get updated post-COVID budgetary numbers until likely July. And so I think the point that Ken raises is, does it make any sense for us as a district to try to put out a budget prior to having those post-COVID numbers in some sense or form? So Dan, I took a stab at it, but wanted to validate my understanding.
That's correct, Mike. If we don't have a budget in place by December, that the state would jump in. And I am not aware, given the pandemic, that there would be any change to the regulations. So we would have several months to come up with a revised budget that would be supported by the towns. Otherwise, the state will step in.
Okay, but even in that scenario, I understand the December deadline. I get that, but even still, we could, at least for the first 5 months, whatever that is, we still could be in a situation for those first 5 months where we have an assumption of what the money is going to be, and it could still fall way short of that. We would know, so maybe we would know in July that we are going to be up a creek for the first 5 months. I mean, maybe the decision from the state comes as early as July, but I still see this I still see the same pitfall that Ken described. It may not be as protracted, but I still see how that could happen. And my thought is that I think it's actually 4 of the 5 towns who have expressed that they don't want this budget now in light of the COVID scenario. And
That's correct. I'm sorry, that's correct.
I think part of me, I'm really trying to look at all the sides of this, because they're all very good points. They really are. Part of me still feels compelled to at least try to bring something back to the towns, even knowing that they may shoot it down. They may shoot down a revised budget. But I have to say this: there's a very good chance that a large chunk of the people who go to vote, whether we do a town meeting, which probably won't, or a mail-in, most of those people either don't know or don't care that we did our budget before all this happened. And, we're going to look like the largest group of tone deaf people that came out of Worcester County if we, throw the largest budget this district has ever seen on the warrant. And I feel like, it's a hard call, but I still see the same pitfall that Ken described, at least potentially for the nearly first half of the year, even if we go the 1/12 route.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So let me, Jeff, I hear you, and let me play out for you, for purposes of simplification, 2 scenarios.
Okay.
One scenario is that we revise our budget tomorrow and we lower assessments by some appreciable number.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say, for example, all the towns pass it. They pass their
Okay.
assessment. That doesn't
All right.
mean that the budget is passed. They pass their assessment. So what does that mean from a state aid perspective? That means that if we're talking about, potential 28% reduction on $30 million, that we're still left trying to find another $8 million.
Right.
Let's say, for example, that we let this play out, and I hear your point, and you give the moment to the administration to respond to it. There's a certain messaging and communication and transparency that needs to be in place here. But let's say, in option 2, that we let the budget play out, it gets rejected, we go into 1/12 budget. Because it's not until after that point in time that we know what the state numbers are. Then we prepare a budget in working with the towns to be able to say, now that we have accounted for that potential, and I'm just putting out a number, $8 million of risk, we know what we can control for that number. And we set out a revised budget that hopefully is better than what we're getting in 1/12 budget. And we provide certainty to the towns around their assessment. And that happens sometime between July and December. I would suggest that that might be a better position for all of us to land on. But I hear you in terms of, the optics, and, perhaps there's some ways of addressing that with our communication and transparency around the process.
Well, yeah. I mean, and thank you for that. Thank you, Mike. I absolutely appreciate that point, and I wish I had a crystal ball. I worry about the situation that Ken described, because I can see how it can happen. I really can. But I also agree with you that if there's a way to basically mitigate the damage to the first half of the year and try to come out of the mess for the second half, I certainly understand the logic of that as well. If that is what we choose to do, if that is ultimately the path that we take. I also agree with you, Mike, that there should be something to the towns basically saying as much. I mean, otherwise that would just feed all kinds of pre-existing bad fires anyway. And I really, that's one of my missions, is to put those fires out. So, okay, thank you. Thanks so much.
Mike, there was a question that Ben had asked early on about transportation. If you could just scroll up. I don't think we've.
Yeah, that.
My apologies, Ben, if I missed that. Go right ahead.
Yeah, no, we don't have to. It's more, and as I typed it and sent it, I'm not sure if this is the place to have that discussion, or it'd be something that would happen in executive session. But it's more, there are, in cases like this, relative in general, with in theory all our contracts, I'm guessing almost all of them have a force majeure clause in it, or it probably should. And I just wanted to make sure that as we start walking through these tough processes that are coming up, that we are 100% aware of all of our options. So that was, I guess that's really, it's more of a statement than a question, I think at this point. And I guess the only other statement I would make against that, more or less on statements that Mike, that you had mentioned, is that my biggest concern with passing a budget now where we don't have a full purview of what's going to happen is we will then drive the administration to make specific, let's call them cuts. If let's say we say, okay, our new budget is $10 million less, that may or may not be true. And, you know, I'm of the tack that it would be great to go with something to the towns that they may or may not approve, but we had readjusted. My biggest issue is I don't think we have enough data to give the administration a path to set out whatever it means for the full fiscal year coming up. Because my understanding would be is the school board did pass a budget. Let's assume it had $4 or $5 million less. The administration then would have to take actions, assuming that that money is not there. Which, in case it could, who knows what happens as the year goes on, that money could end up becoming there, and the administration wouldn't have to make those moves. So that's really my opinion relative to the budget process as it is today. Is we should go forward with the 1/12 until at least we have a better understanding of what direction the school board needs to be provided.
Thank you, Ben. I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to comment on that or not, but just before you do, if again everyone can make sure their microphones are on mute. Still getting some feedback that's coming through. Thank you.
So I'm happy to inquire with legal on the comment that Ben made relative to the contract. Have to dive into the contract and be happy to respond at a future meeting there.
All right, I got Linda.
Just quickly, I didn't catch which contract you were talking about, but I wondered if our bus company contract has a force majeure clause.
So I don't want to speak for Ben, but I assume he's talking about the home to school, the regular ed transportation contract.
Oh, all right.
Okay. Ben, is that correct?
Actually, it's in general to all contracts, right? My guess is every contract we have and we've signed, there are clauses put in case of extenuating circumstances, such as the one that we're in.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And just because, honestly, the more I think about it, the more, frankly, angry I get at the idea that the bus company might not want to apply for federal funds because it's cumbersome, when in fact we might end up having to lay people off. I don't think that I think that they should not leave money on the table and force us to lay people off. I don't think that's right. And so I think if they want to leave money on the table, it should be on them. That's what I think. It should be their cost. It should come out of their bottom line, not ours. So enough said.
Okay. So, Carl. Go ahead, Carl.
All right. So this is a quick question for Dan. So in regard, looking at your phase cut scenarios, so when you added in the all positions 45.75 FTE reductions, based on Member Mills' comments earlier in regards to the three and superintendents as well in regards to the kind of 3 to 2 in terms of if you lay someone off, you still have to pay unemployment and all that. When you were looking at were all of those kind of that 45.75 and then that 2.115 million reduction purely, was that based entirely just off of, or that estimate based off just completely eliminating those positions, or was there some look at possibly like reducing positions? So like instead of someone being full-time, it's maybe a 3/4 position, which like if you have a middle school teacher that instead of teaching 5 classes, they're teaching 4, but they're only getting paid 3/4. The effect would still be larger class sizes, which of course we don't want to see, but the teacher wouldn't be losing their job. And we'd still have them. And in theory, if later on, as I mentioned, if more funding came through the federal government, through the state later on, it's not you're moving someone from 3/4 to full time as opposed to trying to hire someone new down the road. And I just didn't know if any type of that analysis was kind of worked into that, or if it was just purely cutting positions. So we're not paying people, we're not paying benefits, but then we have to do unemployment as well.
Yeah. So Carl, it was purely cutting positions. We didn't look at we didn't go into the granular level of looking at how we might make someone a 2/3 position or 1/5 position, because again, even with that, we're paying for health insurance. So we're paying 78% of a family plan or a single plan. So that's a pretty big whack as well. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at just, okay, how do we do this? Here are the bodies. This is how it would kind of play out. Here are the items. Here are the textbooks. Here is the technology. Whatever it is, those are all the items that we were looking at, and we weren't divvying it up.
Okay. I mean, again, if we get into very undesirable positions of having to make significant cuts, I mean, hopefully at least that's an option that we can look at, because it's a slightly less bad way to go if we're dialing someone from being a full-time employee to being 3/4, 2/3. And again, cost savings aren't necessarily the same, but it might be a way to still get us to where we need to be. But
you'd have to reduce.
Get there.
Yeah, you'd have to, with something like that, in terms of how it would play out financially, you'd have to reduce, a huge number of people to get down to 80%. So, or reduce them to 80% in order to equal something like that. So, I hear what you're saying. It would maybe happen in a handful of cases, and it would save jobs, but we'd have to do it with many people in order to save the same amount that we would with just eliminating the position.
Yeah, again, you figure. I mean, it'd be like, again, you're taking like making every middle school teacher taking one of their classes away, and then making every class that they have remain being 20% as big. And there's a lot of headaches to it. And there might be some opportunities there. I mean, you wouldn't be able to do that with everybody. That's just not realistic. But certainly I would hope at least if there are maybe 10 of those opportunities there, that it'd be at least something they could factor into it. But that's all I'll add with that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Just a quick question, just for context. So, we've been talking about this 45 number. What is our total number of FTEs in the district? Does anyone know?
So that's a Jeff question. Jeff?
That is a Jeff Carlson question. It's I believe our total number of FTEs is a little over 1,000. Jeff, is that correct?
Yeah, that's approximate. Yes.
Okay, good enough. Okay, so Dan, we had stopped after you've presented one of the sheets that you sent out to us in your packet yesterday on the FY21 phase cut scenarios, and then we stopped there. The other document you sent to us kind of modeled a 2% increase over last year's budget, and I'm not sure how much value we're going to drive from that. But was there anything else related to this topic that didn't come up that you wanted to present to us tonight?
That's correct, Mike. What I did in the second document that's color-coded light blue and burnt orange, if you will, is I just took the proposed cuts, and again using phase one, the 2.3, and I applied them to the appropriations, and I did a comparison between the school committee's approved budget as of March 9th and the committee's FY20 approved budget. So I just walked you through those scenarios there. So that's just just taking that data and applying it to the appropriations. One thing that we have not discussed, Mike, Just going back to FY20, well, I think we have indirectly is the contingency planning as well for FY20. Actually, some of that was in the 21 discussion. For example, where we're looking to bring forward $400,000 in circuit breaker. We were made aware again today that our circuit breaker for 20 is not going to be cut. So we're looking at 2.8 prior to June 30. As I mentioned earlier as well, we're looking to bring forward, and this is new given our discussion this evening, approximately 150,000 in school choice, and we're estimating our receipts for school choice at approximately 370,000. As I mentioned earlier, we're looking, if we can, to make a deposit into a transportation revolving fund that was set up a couple of years ago for any excess above the FY20 receipts. We're also in the process of closing out or drilling down on purchase orders and looking to see where any available dollars can be used to pre-buy supplies and materials, either in instruction or in operations and maintenance. As I said earlier, we've got an amended agreement with AA Transportation, and hopefully that will help us to bring forward money in FY20 to 21. We are working also with sped transportation provider as well, with the premise that we would look to bring forward some savings from 20 into 21. And I did see a question, Mike, from Malaya, I believe, as I was speaking there.
Right. So, just to finish the point on items that you're working on for fiscal year 20, are there any other items besides the ones that you mentioned, transportation, settlement, circuit breaker? Are there any other areas that the administration is looking at to potentially bring forward savings from 20 to 21?
So those are the major areas that we're looking to bring forward cash. Unfortunately, our school lunch account, we're projecting a shortfall, so I'll need to resolve that shortfall. And that school lunch, as you know, can't end in deficit. So we'll need to make adjustments between school lunch and the general fund, move some salaries over. And the same is true actually for our early childhood revolving fund. We'll need to make some adjustments between that and the general fund so that account does not end up in deficit. But those are the heavy hitters, if you will, that we're looking at to bring dollars forward into 21.
Okay. We talked about briefly at the end of the last meeting whether or not there is an assessment of unutilized or underleveraged resources that are under examination as a potential way of minimizing or mitigating the potential shortfalls that we have for next year.
Refresh my memory, please.
So I think that we've seen some questions in the past, particularly when we were in the state, as to whether or not school is going to resume or school is not going to resume. As to are there employees who are simply not being used that are still on the payroll, or under leveraged and are still on the payroll? And is there any examination of how better to reconfigure the workforce to realize savings for going into next year?
So, Darryl, do you want to take that one, or I can jump in on that one? How do you?
Yeah, sure. I'll take it. So, yeah, as we kind of look at this, this is going to be I think the one of the more challenging pieces that we have to deal with is just what we will need. Again, what I've shared with this group and the committee is that DESE has urged us not to let people go, or furlough people or lay people off, because of the options of not having the opportunity to bring people back, next year, and not having the proper support staff to educate our kids. Now, with that being said, I think there is going to be some opportunities for some savings moving forward. I'm just not sure how it's going to play out, because I think Malaya mentioned it a little earlier. We may need more staff at different times in different places, and we're not sure exactly what that might look like. So, and I'm just throwing this out there. This is hypothetical, but we say, okay, you know what, cafeteria people, we're utilizing some of the cafeteria people in terms of rotating them through to collect, do our school lunches and so forth. They're going to be going back in and cleaning out the kitchens fairly soon. So how might that look next year if kids aren't going back into school and there's nothing going on in the kitchens? Are we really going to, at that time, we're going to be looking at probably having remote lunches and breakfasts that are done in each town. Right now, we're doing them just in Holden, and they're getting distributed out of the high school, but we'd be doing it everywhere. So there are some different things that we are looking at. We're not ready to talk about them tonight, but they're out there.
Yeah. So I guess to that point, as I recall, the guidance from DESE came before the decision was made to close schools for the rest of the year. And so there's two ways you can go, right? I mean, one is you look at your underleveraged or unutilized people and resources and decide that we can't use them, or you think about how you repurpose them. So, for example, we know that there are things that perhaps need to happen in more so now than there needed to be before. And so what's the creative use on repurposing them? Again, I think that understanding, but just kind of staying still is probably, at least it's not a long-term sustainable option, right? And so understanding how we're treating those groups of people, I think is going to be useful as we think about not just this year, but also whether we have an opportunity to make an impact for next year.
No, I agree. There's another example, and Christine and I were talking about this a little earlier today, just the utilization of paraprofessionals. And right now they're jumping in on supporting students, supporting teachers, working with kids, but we're also having them transfer information over from one special ed platform to another that we were going to actually pay someone else to do. So they're doing that work. So it's given us an opportunity to repurpose them in that sense. So that's an example.
Mm-hmm. All right, Malia, you have a question on the board?
I do. It's not directly related to this year's budget per se, but it is a question before we leave today. I know that one of the reasons we delayed the school choice discussion was that so we would have a chance to consider carefully the budget impact of any decisions or recommendations you might have. And I know that budget or the general agenda on Monday. Is there anything that we need to discuss or consider in this subcommittee before you revise that discussion with the full committee? Because that was one of the reasons that it was postponed in the first place. So I was just asking the question, which just occurred to me.
Right now, no, it's not something that we need to, I think, discuss it at this point in time.
Okay. So, shortly after, the pandemic hit and things started to be locked up, one of the conversations that I had with Dan, and then, subsequently with Dan and you, Darryl, was, how can we help? What are the topics that you want to put forward, and how can we help? So, given the context of what we've discussed, and trying to understand what the pathway is, what's next? What are the next steps, and how can we help?
So, thank you, Mike. And again, I think it's been nice to have the opportunity to speak with all of you in this way, because typically our meetings don't necessarily work in this manner, where we have the opportunity to kind of ask questions and have discourse. In terms of the support from school committee, in terms of the support from business and finance, what we need to do is, again, we're shooting in the dark a little bit, because we do not know what we have, coming to us from the state and from the feds yet. So that's the challenge for us, and we are working under the consideration of a 1/12 budget for next year. As Mike mentioned, 1/12 is not sustainable. The commissioner would come in December 1st and make a decision as to what the budget would be, based upon his assessment of what the towns can pay, and where we are as a district. Doesn't help us that much, but when we're talking about the assistance that this group can provide us, ultimately, I'm looking for some guidance around different areas that we should be focusing on. So what's helpful for me is, even when people say, okay, you know what, Daryl, can you can you tell us what would this be? How might this work? We would like to be able to see A, B, or C. That helps us formulate some of the ideas, because again, we're working, internally with a small group of people. And I think it's easy to become insular with this. So having the outside support, and coming from a different vantage point, having the questions associated with what we're looking at, what we're doing, how might we support a budget moving forward, is really something that's vital for us. So we'll just keep putting things out there. Again, one of my concerns is how much, how far do we go? What are the next steps that we take? And I think those next steps are exactly what we talked about this evening, having the opportunity to talk with the various unions about different options available to us in reference to what we're looking at for contracts next year. Looking at contracts and our contractual obligations. I think Linda and a couple other people mentioned that today, how we might move forward with that. And all of these are very time sensitive. That's the other issue associated with this. So, we're focusing on this and trying to get this rolling as quickly as possible, because again, there are time sensitive dates associated with some of the contracts, and notification associated with not bringing them back. So we want to ensure that we follow those guidelines and contractual obligations as well.
So thank you, Daryl. I appreciate that. I guess I'll say a couple things. I saw a quote earlier today that I thought was particularly apt for this conversation and our times, perhaps, and that is, in times of disruption, clarity is the next best thing to certainty, even if that's uncomfortable. I've added that last part in, but I think it's pertinent. And so to me, to address how we can help, and what kind of feedback we can give in terms of what we might look for, I would go back to two things from my perspective. One, I go back to my 3-valve analogy. And, I think what we looked at tonight was perhaps the impact of valve 1, which is going back to fiscal year 20 standards. I think we need to understand what the impact of cash flow would be in a 1/12 budget scenario. And I think we need to try to cultivate and understand better, and start to plan for different scenarios that might come back to us in terms of what we can expect for funding for state aid. Whether that's 28%, 20%, 14%, whatever it was last time we went through this. I think that there is some work that the administration can do to help us model for that a little bit better. And quite frankly, that's probably the biggest valve of the three. So that's concerning. And again, when we think about this this problem that we're trying to solve, based on the budget that we've passed, which we know is no longer viable, we're looking at, in my estimation, anywhere from a $4 to probably $13 million problem. So that's a range. We talked about the $4 million problem tonight. The second is understanding and asking you, Daryl, and the rest of the administration team to put forward the timeline of what the different triggers are in a calendar-like format. So, for example, if the administration is recommending that we revise the budget in some way or form for one reason or another, we understand by what date we can reasonably do that. If, for example, there are labor implications for staffing decisions that need to be made, we understand what those dates and triggers are. If, for example, there is some period of time before that happens where negotiations could potentially take place to avoid those types of or mitigate, we understand what that is. I don't think leaving here tonight we have that level of clarity into that timeline. And I know that you had mentioned that we're trying to accelerate. Unfortunately, given where we are tonight on May 6th and where we are in relation to the budget season, it seems to me that we probably need to go faster. But I'll leave it there for my point or my perspective, and give it to the floor if there are others that wanted to comment on that. I think Linda has her hand raised here.
I don't think so. Or if I do it, I don't need to bring it up anymore. But let me just second what you just said. I thought that was very well put.
Thank you. All right. Anyone else before Carl, go right ahead.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, and I think really you are spot on in terms of, especially trying to get to clarity. And I would say that probably one of the things that we made, especially Darryl, when you start talking with kind of the different representatives of the union, and it's maybe one of the top things, not even before you start. I mean, would we be looking at like the salary parts of things, but just the that June 15th deadline timeline for, because as it stands currently in our contract, that is a pretty big, that's like a mandatory hack, and odds are we won't even know what things are like from the state are going to look like. I mean, the towns won't even have their meetings by that point, and so while it would be good to be able to give some clarity at that point, even if everyone were to say, okay, we're going to move forward with 1/12, and on June 16th, the state comes back and says, okay, we're magically going to pass a budget that's a 28% cut, then all of the notifications that would have been made by June 15th, all of a sudden we've got a brand new window to look at. And it's just, I think the unprecedented, at least in recent times, kind of situation that we found ourselves in, again, being transparent and being forthright and being honest up front about how we're trying to do the best for our district and the best for our employees, and really trying to find a solution that is really the best for everyone, and to at least be able to hopefully at least to kind of give us a little more leeway to kind of make a better decision in terms of what our personnel manning with personnel levels would need to look like in the fall. Because again, as we've talked about, there's even with 1/12 as a baseline, we kind of have an understanding of what we might need to do to get us there. But that 1/12, again, we've said it's based on getting the same numbers that we've gotten from the state this year, and with a big question mark there, if we're not going to if that's a date that we can't move and we have to make all of our decisions by June 15th, then that's a very different timeline. And I think that really gets at the compressed, faster timeline that that has kind of been talked about. And so I mean, maybe that's one of the things that would need to get pushed towards the top of the list and trying to iron that out, because again, because like I said, if that's a date that's firmly fixed, etched in stone, not like the Martin Luther King Memorial in DC etched in stone that they unetched it and re-etched it, but then that definitely gets us to having to do more faster. But if that's something we could get some flexibility in with that date, then that gives administration, you guys, a little bit more time to work as well. But that's just, I mean, it seems to me that that's kind of the one thing that's, of all the stuff that we have, that's like one date that's fixed, hard and fixed in our contracts, and having to base everything around that when we might not have a good financial picture going forward. Seems like, and again, it's just my opinion, but that seemed like that would be a good starting point with discussions, at least.
Yes, and so Carl, I agree with you, and that time frame, that is the earliest time frame from which we have to work. So that's the time frame that we have to use in terms of dealing with this. Again, we have to look at every option available. The non-renewal process associated with non-professional status teachers is something that is on the table. And again, that's something that we've done that in the past. It's something where we have sent pink slips out to non-professional status teachers, typically with the understanding that we would hopefully be able to hire them back once a budget was passed. In 4 of the 5 towns, that was the circumstances under which that normally occurred. This is different because we're not sure where we're going to be. So that's something that that's on the table. So we're already looking at it.
All right, I have Linda and Malayer, and then I think we'll start to wrap this up and wind down.
Just real quick, if there are statutory deadlines that we need to meet, and if it would be helpful to have those extended, we might want to talk to our legislatures about those.
I can tell you they're not going to extend them.
Oh, okay.
we've run that by DESE already, and right now they're so busy in the legislature with trying to figure out the budget stuff. They're not. There are many things that we tried to bring up, and they're just like, we'd love to, but we're just trying to figure out how we're going to get a budget for FY21.
All right. Thanks.
Malayer.
So my quick question, and I think you may have answered this, but just to clarify, there's a number of things that have come up where we've said, well, we haven't talked to the unions yet, and we really should have a conversation with the unions yet. Have you even scheduled meetings with the unions? That seems like it would be a logical step, and I would hope that that's in progress, perhaps. I mean, I don't know, but I would assume that would be a logical next step. So I'm curious if we have had discussions with them about having a meeting, just to even have a discussion about what their thoughts are, because we really don't know. But so much of what we've been talking about as even options, or knowing whether something is an option that they'd even discuss or not, is, well, I have to talk to the union. So have we had conversations about even scheduling meetings to get their informal thoughts or communication in some way? That seems to be a logical, important step.
So you're right that it's a logical, important step, Malaya, and that is something that we're doing. And again, one of the things we have to do, we want to ensure that before we go into any conversation with any union, we have some information to back it up. So we need to be able to have that, and having Dan clarified some of the information that we presented this evening around the phase 1 plan and the phase 2 and what we're looking at. That's really allows us to now look at what we need to do and what we need to talk about specifically with the unions.
Okay, I appreciate that. I like I said, in the interest of urgency, I guess I'm I am hopeful that those can be done soon, and to be perfectly honest, somewhat surprised that there haven't been discussions about scheduling them for, like, say, the next week, because we know these conversations have to happen. So it's just my opinion in thinking ahead, because we do have so many time constraints, and that's a long process.
Mike, just a quick comment. In last packet, I had prepared a schedule of deliverables. I mean, clearly the dates would have to be refined, but I just use that as a reference point to some of the things that you spoke about. And again, the dates would have to be refined, but there was a schedule in that packet from our previous meeting.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, Dan, and I do think that your point about needing to go back and iterate on that schedule is probably appropriate, because I don't think that, while it's a schedule of some deliverables and it gives us some insight, I think the question that's inherent in both what Malay and others have talked about tonight is understanding by what point do certain kinds of decisions need to be made, and what's the impact of not making those decisions if time were to go by. And I do encourage you to and Daryl and the rest of the team to iterate on what that timeline looks like, as well as coming back and broadening this discussion to what I think is potentially a wider range of impact than what we're talking about tonight.
I agree.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So we're about 2.5 hours in. I think it's been some good interesting discussion at any rate. I at this point, I think we've talked about the main topics that we wanted to cover. I'm not sure. I mean, I want to ask about a next meeting and a timeline, but I'm not sure that you're prepared to answer that yet. So if you are, then that's fine. But if not, I would certainly accept you coming back in a matter of a day or two or three of when we think we can have a meaningful next step of this conversation and reconvene this group.
Sure. Yeah. Again, this call, Dan and I will confer over this, but we will get back to you, Mike, and probably looking at something later on next week.
Okay. All right. I mean, at this point, I would certainly be open to taking a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Anyone for a second?
Second. That's
All those in
Jeff.
favor? Any opposed? Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night today.
Thank you. Thank you.